factors. And the first factor is at page 11 of the paginated report. And it says, as factor 1, which could also be described perhaps as a finding, turning a blind eye to all available psychological and sociological research, evidence, and theory regarding the likely negative impact of relocating institutionalized patients, many of whom were unable to speak, walk, or feed themselves and suffered from various impaired mental states. Can you explain what you mean by this, and particularly what you mean by all available psychological and sociological research and evidence?
So it links to what we were talking about before lunch, which is the underlying concept of the importance of home. And there is a huge amount of sociological and psychological experience, research, and theory that looks at what it means to lose a home in varying contexts. So looking, for example, at children who have been part of human trafficking, people who immigrate, something like forced removals, refugees, people who lose their homes in natural disasters. So it's really sort of quite extensive in terms of trying to understand what it means to lose a home. And because we have an experience of that in our country, it almost becomes something that is common sense in a way. But it's not just common sense. One can go to the literature, and there are volumes and volumes written up about what it means to lose a home and how to manage the loss of a home and prepare for the loss of a home. So that's essentially what I'm referring to. And then, as we were discussing before lunch, if you then apply that to a population group that is dependent and vulnerable, and where people are struggling with different kinds of impairment, it becomes particularly important. So it would be important under any and all circumstances. Just moving into a new neighborhood is hard. But certainly with this population group, it's a critical thing to take into account.
So when you say turning a blind eye, you're referring to the officials who were responsible for the project.
Exactly.
As having turned a blind eye.
Yeah.
On the same page, 11, towards the bottom of the page, you refer to the former MEC. And you say, when asked in an interview why the patients had been transferred against all advice from others, her response was, "How could they know unless they are foretellers?" That's a quote from, those are the words of the MEC. Where does that come from?
That is from, I think, one of the very first carte blanche interviews done, and this was a question that Devi asked the former MEC. And it's every time carte blanche revisits the life Esidimeni transfers, they replay the ex-MEC saying, how could people know about this unless they are foretellers, unless they're psychic?
So you had watched this
I've watched it, yeah.
documentary,
Yes.
and that's where you saw this.
Yes.
So in your view, and in the view of your team, there was evidence available, and had the officials considered and properly taken into account all of that evidence, the move would not have taken place at all, or would it not have taken place in this manner?
The first factor is to really have registered that moving is serious business, and to have taken that on board psychologically. Then if the decision is made to proceed with it, if you fully acknowledged how problematic or how difficult and traumatic moving can be, even if it's a move you desire, if you've taken that on board, then you are going to go about it in a particular way. If you've denied that at the outset, which is what happened, then all the other factors that come into play become inevitable. Yeah. So it's like something that sets the dominoes falling to not recognize how important moving is.
All right, I understand now.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I wonder how the translation services are going. Is it all good? Well, they're both raising their fingers. I suppose it means good, is it? Yeah, because I just want to make sure people who are using earpieces do get what you are saying in their own languages. Very well. But can I ask you a question before council proceed? In the quotation, what does they refer to? How could they know? What is your understanding? Unless they are foretellers.
So the question that Devi asked was, why is it?
Who asked?
Devi, I don't know
The interviewer
the
on
interviewer
Carte Blanche.
on
Okay.
Carte Blanche. I don't know what her surname is. The question she asked is, why is it that although the body of psychiatrists, the anxiety and depression group, and so many different organizations were advising against this, you ignored that? And her answer was, well, how could they know unless they're foretellers? And my argument is, we absolutely know, and we are not foretellers. And we know from experience, and we know from research and theory, and lots of it.
So they refers to, yes, psychological and social, yeah, professionals
Yeah.
who warned against us. Yes, thank you.
So I understand, thank you for explaining factor one and how and why it's so fundamental. Factor two then, as I understand it, relates to the manner of relocation. And what your heading for factor two is ignoring all available psychological, psychiatric, and medical expertise and knowledge gained from clinical experience in the manner of relocation. Can you explain that, please?
Okay, so again, I mean, I think this is something that's almost become common sense in a way, but it is also based on an enormous amount of medical research and psychological and psychiatric research. What we know, without doubt, is that if any challenge, any change, major change has to be faced in life, the more prepared one is psychologically, deliberately prepared, and the more detailed, accurate, thorough, comprehensive information one is given, the greater the possibility of being able to negotiate that change successfully.
And that's in the context of a voluntary change.
Voluntary.
We're talking here about an involuntary, the patients hadn't acceded to this process.
So in an involuntary situation, it is going to apply even more. But even if something is voluntary, the less preparation there is, the greater the possibility that the person won't mobilize internal resources and prepare themselves for it in advance. When something happens and it's involuntary, that all becomes much more important. And this research has been done across the board in terms of different situations. It even results in people living longer in war. The more prepared they are, the more information they're given. It's associated with the length of time people survived in Vietnam. That's how important it is.
And you say...
But is that consideration the same for the bureaucracy on the one hand and the objects or the victims of the move on the other? Are the considerations the same? You're talking about the bureaucrats that must be ready.
Yeah.
What are you saying about the victims of the transport, if it is involuntary?
No, I think that's an excellent point. So it applies equally to both groups. If the bureaucrats don't prepare themselves, there's no way they're going to be able to prepare the people on the receiving end of the change. So one of the reasons as a team we spend so much time sitting and thinking was so that we could be as prepared as possible for the consultations and for the process that was going to follow. That then allowed us to help the families prepare themselves in the interviews.
So you're saying if the bureaucrats were not ready, how could they ever prepare what I'll call the victims or their patients
Exactly.
for what is inherently traumatic.
I was saying to council the other day that I saw an example of a 3-year-old who'd lost all 4 limbs through meningitis, and they had built a prosthetic legs for her, and a year before they put them on, they built the exact copy for a baby doll so that you could spend a year playing with these prosthetic legs on a baby doll before they went onto her. That's how important preparation is. And in this situation, there was, well, we all know it's not that there was nothing. It happened covertly.
When you say justice has referred to 2 categories of people, the bureaucracy and then the victims or the patients on the other hand, where would the families fit into that as far as preparation goes?
So preparing the patients, there's a sort of a, how could one say it, there's a sort of a tower effect in terms of how preparation helps internally. I won't go into the detail unless you want me to. But at the end of those sort of building blocks of the tower, preparation enables primary psychological support mechanisms. In other words, whoever you in an important relationship with, it enables that person to be prepared and to be there, and that becomes absolutely critical. So there's a whole internal process in preparation, but externally, so the families would be preparing internally, the patients would be preparing internally, then that allows the families to be there and support the patients through the process, which is absolutely essential, because in a situation like this, that not having happened resulted in these patients feeling abandoned and would have contributed to the dire outcome.
At page 13 of your report, you say the manner in which this radical displacement was carried out was such a sudden, vicious shock to the system, both individual and family, that it could not be absorbed and digested. Can you explain what you mean by that? That's another finding, that the manner in which the displacement took place had this kind of an effect.
So without preparation, with such an important event, so you've now got 2 things in relation to each other. This is a very important event, and there's no preparation. So that then becomes a shock. This is no longer just a move. This is now a shock to the system. And what happens is that when we're overwhelmed by fear and helplessness, all our neurobiological and psychological mechanisms shut down. And then you don't have a protective shield in place. So now you've got patients moving without a protective shield in place, and then being placed into environments where they're not going to be looked after. There is absolutely no way these people weren't going to die. But equally for the families, what it means is that...
No. Own little problem. Just clearing my throat. You go ahead. I'm sorry.
For the families, this also resulted in it being a shock. So it created a breach in the minds of the families.
I noticed you use that word, breach. You say a breach was created in the minds of the families, and the breach was caused by fright.
Fright, yes. So the fright of now having to deal with this situation means that you're in such a state of fright that you're not there to be in the experience and witness it. So it slips into you, and then you realize it's in you, and then you've got to manage it because of the lack of preparation. So it's like something happening, but you can't experience it in real time. Psychologically, you're not there to witness it and absorb it and find words and assimilate it into prior experience. And then you've got to catch up with yourself.
Yes, now, and I've noticed you've referred to examples to help us understand how that manifested.
Yeah.
The families did try to prepare. The families tried to get information, as did other role players before the move properly began. which leads to your factor 3. You say the families were subjected to relentless violations of trust, continual stonewalling, and incessant deception. Can you explain that? And I just want to make sure that we are on the same page. Is this related to now the attempt to prepare and to get information?
So the more preparation that takes place, the more information we have for something that we're going to have to face. The end result in terms of this tower with blocks is a sense of agency. You adopt a more active role in the whole process, and that's empowering. And the families did try, but then there were these violations of trust. The court agreement from the family's point of view being ignored, calls that weren't answered, just a whole long list of things where it wasn't even then a matter of being prepared, which is important. It was then a matter of no one knowing what the truth was. So now you're not prepared and you're trying to get hold of a truth. And there are all these sort of detours in terms of what the truth is. So that then adds to not being prepared and undermines a sense of agency even further. So now you're dealing with 3 things: the enormity of the change, the fact that there's been no preparation, and then thirdly, the fact that you've got to almost, for the families, put pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together while you are now going through this experience. It's impossible.
Yes. So it was a breakdown of trust and
it shatters the event, which is, let's say, a gestalt, you know, a whole. It shatters that into tiny little jigsaw pieces. And no one knows where the jigsaw piece is. You're given a phone number, but the number doesn't work. You are not given directions to go to a place that's on the other side of Gauteng. You find out what's happening through the news and your neighbor. So you've got like now a jigsaw puzzle in pieces, and you've got to fit them together in the midst of this experience.
Well, I'm worried about the other side of Gauteng. Speaking like a Joburg. If something is not here, it's Durfair. I'm just worried.
I'm thinking about the family members who had their family members in Ali Randfontein, and then they had to go and find them in Hammanskraal. You know, that kind of situation. Not nearby, on the other side of Gauteng.
And for the Justice's reassurance, it could mean people who are in the northern part of Gauteng.
Yeah.
Exactly.
To the other side.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes. I'm from Tshwane, so I'm concerned when people speak like Joburg. But I understand the point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And in these pieces, this jigsaw, these fractured, these shards that exist of bits and bobs of information, somewhere in there is a loved one. Somewhere in there
Exactly.
is
Yes.
that how
This is not a jigsaw puzzle. These pieces were people that were loved.
In factor 4,
Well, before you go to factor 4, on page 15, your page 13, the right bottom corner, at 15, let's talk a little about autopsies and their results. Why are they important?
That's
Families knowing what killed the deceased.
that'll come up a lot in the final factor, but essentially it's another piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Can deal with it then. I just see it on the, it's obviously under the third factor.
Yeah.
Midway, page 15, yeah, okay.
I think what I was trying to demonstrate in terms of the violations of trust is
I
that
see.
across the board, so from the very beginning, where there's this court agreement to consult, all the way to the end, where there aren't autopsy results, it's a pervasive pattern of not completing things, not doing things properly. It's not just the first part of it. It is the entire process is contaminated because it's been blown into bits and pieces. And we're still sitting there without autopsy results. We're still sitting with the bits and pieces. Council Groenewald said the one day, there's a jigsaw puzzle missing. And that's exactly right. There's just a whole jigsaw puzzle that's missing because the bits and pieces are still all over the place, including the autopsy results.
Okay, thank you.
I found factor 4 to be, and I'd like you to explain the concept of dehumanization, because that's what you talk about in factor 4. And you refer to quotes from family members and consultations with family members. The heading of factor 4 is, as the finding, the terrible dehumanization of the patients and its impact on the families. And in this part of the report and in the quotes, there's repeated reference to animal and dog, words like that. Can you explain to us what you mean by this finding?
So essentially, dehumanization is a process of identifying a group of undesirable humans and then treating them as if they're not human. And the families over and over and over again spoke about, for example, Jabulile said that Sizwe was treated worse than a township dog, and township dogs are treated very badly. Stella Mofokeng said that what was so painful for her, she's a domestic worker, and the dog in the place where she works is treated better than her brother had been treated. So the families had a clear sense that the people they loved had been turned into non-humans, which is why the references to animals come up over and over again. So the dilemma with this is you've now not only got an untenable psychological and emotional situation in terms of the move, the lack of preparation and the violations of trust, but if people on top of it had then not been dehumanized, who knows? But they were dehumanized. And so now you've got that next domino block that falls. And that is directly linked to how traumatized the families are, because they have to now sit with all those memories of Sizwe being treated like a township dog in their minds and somehow come to terms with that.
You talk about, you use a language of torture in this context of dehumanization. About patients being virtually tortured to death through shocking neglect and cruelty. Is that not, why do you use that word? I imagine you would use it guardedly. It's a very strong term, torture.
It is a strong term. I think once you decide that a group of people is undesirable and you dehumanize them, then actually you're in the terrain of torture. So if you take a group of people who didn't know the move was coming up, weren't prepared for it, and they are moved on the backs of trucks, tied with sheets, without supervision, out ID documents, out wheelchairs, out medical files, this is no longer a human endeavor. That is in itself a torture. This is not saying, okay, you're going to move, but we're going to do it in the most humane way possible. This was done inhumanely. And so now we're in the terrain of torture. And then that doesn't stop, because the patients are moved into these filthy, dangerous environments as if they are not people. And then, for example, the Reverend Maboe saying that they wouldn't give Billy water because he would pee in his pants. So then you've got the withholding, however people were fed or weren't fed, whatever happened in terms of all of that. You've now got something that is a basic human right, which is water and food, has become complex. That's torture. When you torture people, that's what you do. You play around with food, you play around with water, you deprive them at a sensory level, you overcrowd them, and all of those features of actively torturing people are in this situation.
In your experience, in your long experience, have you had direct experience of counseling victims of torture?
Yes.
And how does this compare?
So my original experience was I was part of an organization called Detainees Counseling Service. It was an underground organization during the 80s and the 90s so that the National Party couldn't ban it. We worked in small cells and we met at different places and we worked with people who had been detained and tortured repeatedly. We worked with people who came off death row. We worked a lot with teenagers and young adults in the townships who would be thrown into jail and then released the following day. So that's part of my experience. I worked at the 702 Crisis Center for 10 years where I was exposed to all kinds of crises and traumas. And then I ran the debriefing group at the trauma center. And of course there, I was working with clinicians who were coming out of the prisons, coming back from Rwanda. So my exposure to trauma and torture is pervasive and vast. And I have never seen levels of trauma like this, ever.
And when you speak about torture, you're not talking about it as somebody who doesn't understand what torture is and... So I just wanted to
no, I'm talking about
that you're
I'm
not
talking
using
about
the word.
People who had electric shocks to different parts of their body over and over again, who'd been beaten to within an inch of their lives, hung upside down.
You've seen torture, you've seen
yes.
victims of torture, you know what it looks
Yes.
like. That's all. And here this dehumanization process goes on. And I was about to ask you this, and I partly already have been answered, is what the impact of this is on the families.
So all of these first four factors are going to weave into each other and create for the families an extraordinary situation of trauma. Because remember now, they're not prepared. So this experience slips in before they're there to witness it. So it can't be assimilated and made something that's part of the past. Then on top of it, there's no way of knowing who can be trusted, and you're looking for all these jigsaw puzzles. Then you're left with all these images of how dehumanized people are in your mind. So it's the imagery, and the dehumanization is central to that. That becomes part of the trauma. You can't let go of the image, but you also haven't assimilated the image.
And sticking with this theme and with factor 4, you speak about through the consultation process the disempowerment of the families and a reference to one of the family members being told, well, if you don't like it, then take it. It was in relation to Jabalilo Hlatswayo.
If you don't like it, take Sizwe home.
Take him home.
Well, this is all part of the dehumanization. If you're not happy with our decision, take Sizwe home. And this whole thing of saying to the families, well, why did you get rid of them? Why did you throw them onto life Esidimeni in the first place?
Yes.
It's part of a dehumanization, and it plays into stigmatization. So stigma is, it's a very hard and painful part of mental illness. Yes?
Because I want to have a follow-up question to that, which is, if you say to a family member who is concerned, and you say to the family member, well, if you don't like it, then take your child and go. But the family member is in a position where that's just not possible.
Exactly.
And so what is the impact of that be to say, well, you do something about it if you don't like it? But in fact, you can't do anything about it.
It's the same as family members who say they wanted to take their loved one home that day when they saw where they'd moved to, and then were told they couldn't and didn't. These two things are mirrors of each other, because you land up with this internal situation of massive self-blame. So although it's not true, a lot of these people could not be looked out of some kind of care. It doesn't have to be, a massive hospital, but they needed constant care. And most of these families couldn't manage that. Most of us could not manage that with all the resources we have. And a lot of these families don't have the resources on top of it. So there was no way that they could have made a different decision. But the mind is not just rational. So what happens inside the mind is, I'm to blame. I should have done something differently. It's what Anna was saying on the stand yesterday.
And I'm Tembu. And the stigmatization, are you referring to the stigmatization of mental health care users because of their condition? Is that what you're talking about? Because you also mentioned it in the context of families, and I'd just like you to explain if I understood that correctly, how would the families be stigmatized?
So we struggle as humans with social stratification, and so we sort of generate this idea of like a mythical norm, like Johannesburg is the mythical norm. And then anything outside of that mythical norm, we disqualify. And that stigmatization, that has a profound impact separately, psychologically, because then people land up feeling responsible for their own deficiencies. Families land up feeling responsible for the person who's deficient. And that to sort of bear that insult, negativity takes a toll psychologically, and that's called stereotype threat. So people who are stigmatized are at much greater risk for physical illness and disorder. There's a very high level of comorbidity between mental illness and physical illness, and stigmatization is partly why that happens. And the stigma affects the whole family. Stigmas don't just affect the person with a disability, because the family has to struggle with internal conflict. Do I try and look after this person at home? Many of these families tried for years. But then the level of incapacity in terms of language, mobility, impulse control, it just creates a very complicated picture. But nevertheless, all of this will have been struggled with internally by the families. So it all boils up when something like this happens.
And where does the class issue fit into all this? Would low resources make one even more vulnerable?
Exactly. So that's why I say in my report, we're talking here about a group of people who are vulnerable, who struggle with poverty. It's clear in terms of how the families spoke in the interviews. That's why so many of the families have said at this arbitration they would go at month end to visit their loved ones. Why? Because they've been paid. And that's the struggle in terms of low resources. You don't have the option of just getting in a car and going whenever you want to go. You're struggling all the time. Every single resource counts in terms of class.
And there are private institutions which provide mental health care, but they probably would not be available to families which don't have resources to afford those monthly rates. So you have, I don't know, it's your field. You have stigmatization that you've described so well, and then you're stuck with low resources which do not allow you a choice, an option.
Exactly.
to resist the stigmatization or the vulnerability.
And that is a real thing. So I'm sure everyone who's listened to the families who've come up here, they are sharp and bright and assertive. They can express themselves. So this is not a function of who they are as people. This is a function of not being as resourced as it is possible to be, and then having to cope with someone who has a mental disability.
And then to add to it, to add to all of what you and Justice Moseneke have been discussing, after a loved one dies in these conditions, to be told, why are you crying? Why do you really care? You dumped them in any event in our hands.
Yes.
So that would exacerbate the feelings and the discussion that you've just had.
Terribly so. So the trauma of the experience is now going to intersect with the most awful self-blame. And you can see that across the board in the families we interviewed and the families who've testified. So Maggie Musiani has this dream over and over again about her brother Caswell. And he's sitting in a chair, and he isn't in his own clothes, and he looks hungry, and he wants food, and she knows he is saying in the dream, my soul is not at rest, I'm not at peace, and she interprets that as, you should not have left me there, you should not have let me die. And she has that dream over and over and over again. So that would be an example of it.
Is this Ms. Mosiani, who's also unable to eat meat now?
Exactly. No. Yes, that's right.
Is it Caswell's sister?
Caswell's sister has the dream.
It's Caswell's mother who can't
And
eat
it's
meat
Caswell's
anymore.
mother who now can't eat meat and is diabetic because of the flashbacks.
Why can't she eat meat anymore?
So Caswell's face had some kind of massive blister on it that was filled with a sort of a muddy fluid. And when his body was being prepared for burial and they tried to clean it, all this blood flowed out. And so what's happened with her is every time she sees meat, it reminds her of Caswell's face, and she can't eat meat. And that's pure trauma.
I'm going to move off from the dehumanization.
Yeah.
I think
Before you move, I just want to canvass one point of indignity. The mortuary and decomposing bodies. You write about that on page 17, the end of the first paragraph. Would you expand a little more about that? Everybody who's been here knows that's one of the bees in my bonnet. You probably have been. You've been watching, you tell me. About mortuaries which are ill-kept and don't do what they're meant to do. And bodies started decomposing. What is all that? Vis-a-vis the family, vis-a-vis dignity issues.
So these 5 factors were relatively clear, but I kept trying to think, what is underneath this? And eventually for me, that was the issue of dignity. That if you start off and you don't see the other as having inherent dignity, all of this becomes possible. And then you see that across the board, from the beginning of the move, all the way to people not being told their family members were dead, never mind whether they'd been moved, not being put in proper mortuaries. I mean, Pumzila's example of finding her brother Solly in the butcher mortuary is the typical example of that. it's in a way the evidence of the dehumanization, which is a function of not seeing the other as having inherent dignity. And so you can treat a body as a thing, as a non-human thing. You don't have to treat the body as a person and as someone who was loved. Then the problem for the families is they've got to live with that. They're alive, and they've got to live with that knowledge and all those images and memories.
There's also there are various cultural traditions and beliefs in different parts of our society, and we do have a very diverse society.
But if you're not a person anymore, culture doesn't exist. And then you can override all the cultural practices.
Yeah. Because I think where counsel comes from is here. Many witnesses who came here said, in my culture, I need to know where my loved one died. Where was the last gasp? And what did he say, if anything? And you have a traditional obligation to try and pick up her spirit from there and take it along to the home, going back home. In other words, if you have died wherever, there's always an attempt to try and take you back home and only then bury you. And it's done symbolically, as though you're, and people believe they carry your soul from wherever, in the open field, and take you to where you truly belong before you are laid to rest. And the complaint here was, we couldn't do this.
I write at the end of my report about the fact that a relationship with someone you love doesn't end when that person dies. And that's what you're talking about. The person who has died continues to generate messages inside us long after death. You can have someone alive inside you years after they've died. So the issue of culture is so important here, because the message from the dead is, where is my soul? What have you done with it? Where have you left it? So that's exactly right. That's what the families are having to deal with, because a relationship goes on with a person even after they are dead. It doesn't end there.
Yeah.
On a similar note, I do think it's quite an important point, because a lot of the hearings have been about what led to the death. But the trauma, what we're now discussing with this expert witness, goes beyond what led to the death, but also what happened afterwards.
Exactly.
And the importance culturally of how a dead person's body is handled and the dignity with which it is treated. And we've heard of, and we know of the importance, as I said, you can't grow up in this country and not understand the diverse cultural practices wherever you come from. In an Islamic practice, you'd also need to deal with the body in a particular way, and cleansing, and that ritual is very important. It can't take place when you can't find the body. It can't take place if the body is too decomposed by the time you find the body. And that passage of time has its own separate trauma post the notification of death.
Exactly. So I think almost everyone in this room who's lost someone they loved will know what it's like to go and say goodbye to that person. And if you then are having to say goodbye to that person 6 months later when their body's decomposed, it really is horrendous. It's hard enough taking one final look at someone you love and walking away and knowing you won't see that person in the world again without that body being filled with worms, as Ntombi Futhi was describing.
Is it correct to say that your world does change. Your world is no longer the same. And even if it was not in such traumatic circumstances, but especially in such traumatic circumstances, that you're no longer the same person you were before.
But what helps you is that you find, through mourning, you find a way of going on having a relationship with the person who's died in your internal world. And what's happened in this situation is that all of that has been contaminated.
Thank you. And maybe that does lead us into factor 5, what you call the prevalence of severe, continuous traumatic stress disorder as a result of what the families have witnessed and experienced. Can you explain what that term means? It seems to be a term of art, continuous traumatic stress disorder. I've never heard of it before. I've heard of PTSD. Can you explain, can you explain that factor for us?
So essentially, the trauma discourse is about what happens to the body-mind when you experience a shocking, unpredictable, unexpected, horrific event that threatens psychological and physical integrity. And those kinds of events are called traumas, and they tend to have the same impact regardless of the context and regardless of its meaning. So that's what's so important about the idea of trauma. So you could be looking at the victims of Hiroshima, Los Desaparecidos, in South America. You could look at apartheid, you could look at the Holocaust, you could look at Rwanda, you could look at what's happening in Aleppo, in Syria. And although those people have very different cultures, speak very different languages, the impact of those events would be similar in terms of what happens to the body-mind. So that's post-traumatic stress disorder. When the stress is not finite with a beginning and an end, that's what we call continuous traumatic stress. And continuous traumatic stress is the worst of all. If you go through a trauma and then afterwards you can try and assimilate it and make sense of it, you can make it part of your past. If you go on being traumatized, which is what's happened with these families, that decreases your resistance continually. So you become more and more traumatized with continuous trauma. And that's what has happened in this situation.
You say that, and I'm quoting from page 20 of your report, 18 perhaps on your version. The imprint of the traumatic event comes to dominate the person in that subsequent stressful life events are perceived in the light of the prior trauma.
Exactly. So the more you're exposed to the sensory reality of the trauma, the smell, the sight, the sound, the more life-threatening it is, the more it results in harm or the death of someone you love, the worse the imprint on the mind, the more florid the imprint. And because the experience hasn't been assimilated, it's now you've got all these imprints, and they keep returning in these unbidden ways, through flashbacks, intrusive images, dreams. So in a way, the dilemma here is that it's not just the experience you've been through, it's that you've been through an experience that you missed. But all the imprints are there, and your mind is trying to catch up with itself. So these imprints keep coming back so that your mind can catch up with the experience. That's trauma. And these images and these memories are so sensory, that generates the worst kind of trauma. So, for example, Vaughan van Rooyen.
I was about to go to Vaughan van Rooyen.
Who says that
Can I just take you there? It's page 22 of the paginated report, Justice, and it's about a third of the way down the second paragraph. It says, Vaughan van Rooyen says, and it quotes, The other day there was a terrible stench of dogs messing in the street, and the smell made me, and I think you mean think, the smell reminded me of Cindy.
So
The smell of the terrible stench of dogs messing in the street. And the smell reminded me of Cindy.
So that's an example of trauma where Vaughan's memory is Cindy smelt like the dogs messing in the street the last time he saw her. And so there's now this external cue, and in his mind now is the image of his sister Cindy. That's the imprint that now, because of this external cue, returns in an unbidden way.
And that, the other example you give in that context is Yvonne Masiane and being unable to eat meat. Is that's the same?
It's the same kind of thing. But it can happen, for example, Stella Mofa King. So she hasn't unpacked her brother's room. She hasn't burnt his clothes, which is part of what she should have done in terms of her culture. But she goes shopping. And she'll come home, and he was diabetic, and she'll realize she's bought all this diabetic food, and it's as if she's forgotten that he's dead, and he doesn't need the diabetic food anymore, and that's partly linked to the callousness of the staff at the NGO, because she asked one of the caregivers, what are they eating? And the person, and she said, because my brother's diabetic, and the person responded, very sarcastically and said, we're giving them cake and cookies the whole time. So this has sort of left this imprint in her mind, and now that's unbearable for her. So she goes and buys all this diabetic food. Then she sees she's got the diabetic food, and then there's the horror of having to realize he is dead.
The second component, as you call it, of this trauma picture, and you say this at page 23, and I'm quoting for your report, is that the assumptive world of these families has been shattered. What does that mean?
So mostly our work as clinicians is to try and help people undo illusion. There's one situation where illusion is healthy, and illusion, though these illusions break down during trauma, we live with 3 illusions that help us manage daily life. If we didn't have these illusions, our levels of anxiety would be so high we wouldn't cope with the ordinary activities of a day. So those 3 illusions are: nothing will happen to me today, I will go on living. It's an illusion. Minibuses go through red robots all the time, and they can crash into you, and we know this, and we prepare for it so that we can stay alive. If you thought, I could die today, you wouldn't be able to drive on the road. So that's one illusion. A second illusion is, at the end of the day, it'll work out. The world is a safe place, it's a fair place, it's a just place. We absolutely know that's not true. We're sitting here. But you can't live believing somebody's going to do something unjust today. The world isn't a fair place. The third illusion is no one will try to harm me or anyone I love. Because again, if you walked around every day thinking, I'm sure somebody's going to harm me any minute now, you'd be so preoccupied with that anxiety, you'd be dysfunctional. So those unarticulated beliefs we hold without knowing it, and they're part of health. When you go through a trauma, that's the assumptive world. When you go through a trauma, those 3 illusions or assumptions are shattered. So part of the work you're trying to do after a trauma is get the illusions back in place. And if you can't get the illusions back in place, you're in trouble, which is hopefully partly what this arbitration can do for the families.
Well, I can't resist. That's wonderful. That's most informative. But I can't resist telling you that when I grew up, my grandfather always said, "Kuzolunga mtanam mtanam."
And what does that mean?
Well, Where's the interpreter? Can somebody tell our expert here? Most days when I went and left the home to go to school or to come back, my grandfather would say, my grandson, all will come right. All will be well.
Exactly.
Lo and behold, he was right. But it is fascinating to hear it, that we live through that illusion. And if he were wrong, of course, I wouldn't be here. I would be some messed up person somewhere.
Exactly.
Because that assurance would have dissipated. But he assured me every day, virtually. Kuzolunga mtanam mtanam. And sometimes it's right and sometimes it goes wrong.
Yeah.
Like the people who are with us here today.
But you believe the illusion, and that's what allows you to function until it's shattered.
I hear that. And you're really telling us that the illusion was then shattered.
Yeah.
Because it was never quite met or fulfilled.
Yeah. And the thing about shattered assumption theory is that obviously these illusions can be shattered because you're caught up in Hurricane Katrina. But when the illusion is shattered and it's human-induced, it is the most violent of all. We deal better with natural disasters in terms of shattering the illusions than we deal with human-induced trauma. So in this situation, it's not only human-induced, but human-induced in the most violent way. And so the shattering of those assumptions for these families is devastating. It's like the illusions have morphed into the opposite. So the families now believe others will harm them, as opposed to having the illusion of, mostly people won't try to harm me.
I'm sure you'll be asked questions about what all this means for the survivors. But I'm not going to ask you the question. I'm sure you will be asked. We talk about shattered illusions of family members, because the deceased are deceased.
Yes.
But I'm sure you'll be asked questions about what about those who survived, in the sense that they didn't die. Where would that level of trauma sit, and what would be the origin of that trauma? But I'm sure you'll deal with that when you're asked. Counsel?
Thank you, Justice. The third, or the fourth, I've forgotten now which component of trauma
third
we're looking at,
component of
but
the trauma picture.
It's the aspect in respect of which you say, you talk about central organizing fantasies of the self and of the family. I understand this to be separate now from the assumptive world that you've described. You're now talking about the organizing fantasy of the self and the family. Please, can you explain what you mean by that and what the impact of that is on the family members?
So in this trauma picture, you've got firstly a self that has been through something but wasn't able to witness it, and that's destabilizing. Then the ordinary illusions we all hold in place so we can manage levels of anxiety have now been shattered. Thirdly, all individuals and families have a version of themselves. Whether that version is accurate or not, there's the central organizing version. This is who I am as a person. This is who we are as a family. And often it's false, or there are aspects of it that are false. And we're attached to these versions of ourselves and of our families. When you go through a trauma, we behave in unexpected ways. And so the fantasy shatters. The organizing fantasy shatters. And if people don't know that's what's happened, they feel as if they're going mad because they're trying to get back to an old version of the self or an old version of the family. And you can't, it's gone. That's what trauma does. But the minute you know that, you can start working with the loss of that version. What does it mean? How does that feel? And you can begin to create a new organizing fantasy, which might actually be healthier. So what's happened in this situation is those versions of family and self have been obliterated. And that's part of trauma, and if you don't know that, it makes the trauma feel as if you are going crazy.
Is that why Lucas Mokgwenyane says, I'm not the person I used to be?
Exactly. And all the families talk in that way. I'm no longer myself. Christopher was my treasure. Boitumelo and Sophie saying that their family version now is a black page. That's all it is. And they're just falling endlessly and endlessly into this black page. And before, they were just coming to terms with the fact that their mother had vascular dementia, and she'd been this fierce, extraordinary this extraordinary, fierce person. She was their mother, and they're getting used to a new version of their mother, and then she dies in this way, and so that very fragile new version is now shattered. Thank you.
You also say that, and because I think context is important, I keep referring to our particular country, our history, and our cultural diversity. And you speak at page 25 about an intergenerational scarring. On page 25, bottom of the second paragraph, you say most of these families have the legacy of apartheid behind them, and now they have this tragedy to integrate. This scenario is likely to result in particularly powerful intergenerational effects. What do you mean by that?
So this goes back to what Justice Moseneke was asking about before, that this situation is not just about death and loss. It is about the disappeared, which in Argentina was such a big thing, the los desaparecidos. The problem with the disappeared is you can't actually begin a proper process of mourning. So you get frozen in some limbo state because you don't have closure, you don't have an explanation, you don't have the jigsaw puzzle, and that uncertainty dominates your relationship with the person that has died. So you're suspended in a way in the not knowing, in the untruths, in the autopsy results that aren't there, and struggling with your trauma. When that happens and you can't begin to grieve and mourn and try and get through what has been lost and arrive at a new version of yourself, it affects the next generation. And that's intergenerational trauma. So that potentially with this, we're not only looking at the people sitting here who are traumatized, but their children, and usually it's the third generation that expresses that trauma. So, yeah, that's the point of it.
You have spoken about the degradation, you use those words, degradation, decimation, dehumanization. What do you, in all of what you're saying, it sounds like this is very unusual. I would hope. What do you and your team take away from that, this particular set of facts and the trauma that you've not only yourself now experienced as a result of your work on this, the trauma of the families? Where does this lie? And I know it sounds callous, but where does it lie on the scale of trauma, of what we know and the terrible, historically we know of examples of trauma, of degradation, of dehumanization. Where does this lie on that scale?
If we had to see this as a continuum, it lies at the extreme end of a continuum where it starts to be a crime against humanity. The complexity of this picture and all the factors that are part of it is unthinkable. So I am a changed person because of this. When I try and explain to people what that means, with all the trauma work I've done in my life and with all my own losses in life, I feel as if for the first time I've touched what I would call antimatter. And I'm sure people who, you know, were devastated by apartheid or were in the Holocaust know that. But I now feel like I have touched something that I could only describe as antimatter. It is unthinkable.
When does continuous trauma end? I'm not asking about time, I'm asking about in which circumstances would it end? In page 19, you describe it, you tell us what it is. And as counsel was asking the question, continuous traumatic stress disorder, must or does it have an endpoint?
It can have. So in this situation, there would be a number of things that would help it to have an endpoint. So one of the things that is a pattern in this entire situation from the very beginning of the Marathon Project to the present is a disavowal. So even in the arbitration, we've had people from the Gauteng Health Department who are representing the government operating in a position of disavowal. Everyone is saying, no, I can't answer that, somebody else must answer that. Then the next person can't answer a whole lot of things. So you had the disavowal of reality during the actual process. We still have it in the arbitration. What will help the families is for the Department of Health to accept responsibility for presenting the full picture to us. Instead, we're now having to put another picture together with bits and pieces of evidence. So with that kind of disavowal and maybe we're working towards that, but essentially, unless we have a full picture with explanation, it becomes very hard to move on.
And where's the place of apology in all that? The state has always apologized for regard to every single witness.
It's essential.
Where does apology sit in all this?
It is absolutely essential. Because apology and presenting a full picture is all part of starting to say to the families, you are not non-humans, and the people you loved were not non-humans.
Yeah, but still, the question I put was, when does the continuity end? Or what would make the continuity end in a continuous trauma situation?
Well, it can be various things. So
in other words, I want to understand how healing is going to come.
Information, such as autopsy results, explanations for what happened, the apology, as you say. So if enough information, enough detail, enough explanation is in place, what that means is the families can't be expected to accept responsibility for this. It's the Gauteng Health Department that must fully accept responsibility. And then that allows the families to begin to focus on their own experience. Up until now, the families, with the help of Section 27, have been fighting for who's responsible for this. And you can't be working with mourning and assimilating the trauma if you're having that fight in the real world. It uses up all your energy. So when responsibility is clear and explanations are complete and there's full disclosure and unreserved apologies, then the families can breathe a sigh of relief, and then they can begin to focus on what's going on inside them.
And where in all of that would you place financial accountability, financial responsibility? In other words, where would compensation in a financial form sit in that matrix?
I think it's an important part of it because it's part of an organization saying, we are responsible, we are accountable, and this we're not only going to say we are sorry, but this is how we are going to atone. It's part of a process of atonement. But in terms of the families we interviewed, that has to go along with psychological and emotional, genuine memorials, ceremonies. That is very, very important to these families. So the money is important as a form of atonement, and also the families have, for example, Vaughan again. It's extremely upsetting for him that his sister Cindy, he named 7 of his children with names that begin with C because he loved his sister so much, and she is now buried on top of his uncle. So, you know, money is going to help with things like that, proper burials, etc., and it's a form of atonement. But it doesn't replace registering this emotionally and psychologically. So, for example, again, Boitumelo and Sophie, they kept saying in their consultation, that woman, she was our mother. We want her name called. Her name was Rayasibe Rahab Mangena. It's that, over and over. We want her name called. And what the families are saying is we want these people we loved who were turned into non-humans to be rehumanized. And that's critical in terms of the continuous traumatic stress ending.
Thank you. Council.
Thank you, Justice. At page 27 of the report, Ms. Trotter sets out the elements of reparative and restorative justice that
Yes.
that could be of help in the process, and there are 6 parts to it. I don't need to go through it again because Ms. Trotter's just summarized that. Ms. Trotter, that brings me to the end of your report. Is there anything that you would like to add that that you weren't able to speak to thus far?
Well, I can assure you I've seen the love letter all of your professionals have sent to me. In ending, we urge Justice Dikgang Moseneke to pay heed of the following. So I've read every one of them, being mentioned by name. But what else as Council was urged you want to say? You're going to be asked questions by the rest of Council. So it's going to be quite a bit of talking still to do.
Last Friday, Council asked me to read the Hillsborough report and add it, which is partly why I got a new report. And it's a 122-page report. And eventually I decided to end my report with what the Reverend James Jones said, because I thought it was so applicable.
Yes.
And he says that the bravery, so now he's talking about the Hillsborough disaster, but it absolutely applies in this situation.
Yes.
The bravery, dignity, and tenacity of families who fight for justice has a vicarious quality to it. It is of value to the whole nation in that it ensures that the pain and suffering are never repeated.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That's very instructive. Thank you very much. I saw that. Yes, and in many ways it is true, isn't it? I'm going to, are you done, Council?
I'm done.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Justice. For now.
Advocate Krause.
Thank you, Justice Moseneke.
But it's also like when we do bad. But if we're in important positions, our deeds that tend to taint the rest. It's like noble deeds.
Exactly.
And an ethically sound struggle tend to elevate all of us. But horrible deeds tend to diminish all of us. Quotation is valuable. Advocate Clark.
Thank you. We represent the survivors, and Justice Moseneke had said that we will ask questions about the survivors, and we would just like to get your thoughts on this. The family members who have lost loved ones, they've been traumatized, and you've dealt with that. But the trauma is far more than just losing the loved one. Isn't that so?
Yes.
For instance, the beginning, you've dealt with it. Nobody knew where people were moving. Would that be a start of the trauma?
Most of the report would apply regardless of whether people died or survived. So there would be aspects, for example, that the relationship with someone we love goes on when they die, which wouldn't apply. But the issues around relocating, lack of preparation, dehumanization, all of that is going to apply with the survivors. The thing that is going to be very hard for the survivors, I don't talk about this in my report, but I could have added it, is that because home is so important, and because this happened in this way, it sets in motion fantasies, images in the mind of the individual. And those are going to be about awful things, not being loved, being abandoned, being forgotten. So the survivors are having to live
I
with
just
that.
want to stop you there. Are we talking about the surviving patients now? The
Surviving
mental
patients, yeah.
health? Yes, I will get
And
to,
for the families too.
I'm still at the families,
Yeah.
if we can just remain with the families for a moment. The feeling of helplessness, not being heard. What effect does that have on families?
It's going to be the same. It's a complex thing when people survive, because death is devastating in terms of the loss, but survival throws all the illusions into question. Why did I survive? Why me? I shouldn't have survived. So all the conflict around surviving for the families and for their family members has to be dealt with. It's not an easy thing to survive. It's a good thing, but it's not an easy thing psychologically.
Could I just also ask you, we have family members looking for missed healthcare users. They're just missing. What effect would that have on a family?
That's devastating. So that is the issue of the disappeared. That you are now frozen in a state of uncertainty, waiting and looking. And so getting on with life becomes very difficult.
And you in a position that you don't have all the resources that other people might have. That will also make you feel more vulnerable, wouldn't that?
It would be devastating. I mean, if you think of children who go missing in the world and how parents set up whole organizations to look for those children, and then in a situation like this, you don't have those kinds of resources, that is devastating.
Somebody said that being poor is being without choices. And the family members have experienced this very badly because the few choices that they had were taken away. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Well, I think that is true, but I think what's extraordinary about these families is in spite of that, they kept trying to generate choices for themselves.
Yes. If we could just take you a little bit further then, after the mental health care users have been found, they've found them hungry, thirsty, thin. What effect would that have on a family member?
So all the issues around trauma are going to be there in terms of the return of intrusive images, memories, dreams. But what is going to be very important in that situation is that at some level, however much relief there is in finding someone, some fracturing has happened in the relationship. So a lot of your work is going to be about relationship repair. And it's repairing the actual relationship with the person. Even if you love that person, nevertheless, that relationship will have been fractured. And what's hard about that is it generates a lot of internal conflict. And then that's hard because you're alive and you're happy you found the person you love, and yet you're filled with all this conflict. Anger, violent feelings, murderous rage, feelings of not being loved. So all of that has to be worked through.
Feelings of guilt of not being there.
Exactly, in terms of repair. And it's very hard to do that alone. It's very hard for us in our ordinary lives to do that.
If I could perhaps move to the patients themselves. They've also suffered through lack of medicine, lack of food, lack of water. What effect would that have on somebody with mental health issues? Or let me first start with any person. What effect would that have?
And we're talking about patients who survived.
Yeah, we're talking about patients who survived.
I think the hardest thing is going to be the fact that we are not just rational, intellectual beings. And so an experience like this is going to mobilize fantasies, essentially. Am I loved? Was I abandoned? Why did this happen to me? Maybe I'm not good enough. And that would happen with anyone, where you start to worry inside. You imagine things, and you start to worry about what you're imagining. So the survivors are going to be really struggling with that. When you are disabled, that's going to be even worse. Because if you're dependent, if you can't walk, if you can't feed yourself, then something like that is life-threatening. If you are struggling with someone and you're not disabled, you can think, I am so out of here. When you're dependent, you can't think that. So you're trapped in some way in the disability, and then these fantasies will be churning inside, which you'll be having to deal with. It will be excruciatingly painful inside those people.
Some of the survivors were moved multiple times. Unexplained. It can't be explained why they would have been moved so many times. We've spoken about the brick mother. How would this affect them, having just been moved multiple times?
It magnifies all the issues. So the more people were moved, the more it magnifies the issues, the more it shatters the assumptions, the harder it becomes to trust what anyone says. So you're going to have a massive erosion of trust in the other, and you're dependent.
Could I just have a moment, please?
Yes, certainly.
Could I also just ask you, some of these mental health care users were in facilities where other people died overnight or left in the same wards. What effect would that have on the survivors?
So that's part of your trauma picture. The more you're exposed to the sensory reality of the event, which in this case would be the sight, the smell of it, the more that results in the possibility of your own life being threatened, and the more you witness the death of others, the worse the trauma.
Thank you, Justice.
Well, while you're there, talking about survivors, evidence suggests patients, which include those who survived, or maybe those who survived, were crowded, were unwashed. They lived in smelly and stinky places. They did not have proper bedding. They were visibly hungry. They would rush to the door every time a visitor came. In some instances, male and female patients were thrown into small wards together or rooms together. and on it goes. What would that have done for the survivors? And then they, of course, are lucky enough not to die. What does that do to the trauma scenario you've been telling us about?
I think that's what council was asking, like, where on this continuum are we? And we are at an extreme end of the continuum of trauma. I mean, that set of circumstances, it is like people coming out of the Holocaust. And how do they begin to metabolize that experience, to put words to it? And sometimes it actually is not possible. That's how hard it is.
You know, the question of consent has come up in the evidence quite often. Even at the end, survivors were basically taken to wherever, even if they were better circumstances, taken back to life as Esidimeni, whether in Randfontein or Waverley or wherever else. But throughout the multiple transfers, I hear no evidence about consent, about talking to them.
It's very disempowering.
Yeah. But would that be mitigated by the fact that they were taken back to normalized institutions?
I think that would
I'm
help.
struggling with the continuity of the stress condition. You know, how do you break it, even in relation to survivors?
I think normalizing things and going back into a situation that feels more ordinary is going to be massively helpful. But I think it has to come with someone sitting with the survivors and saying, I know what you've been through. We're back to the illusions. It is all going to be all right now. What your grandfather used to say.
Oh, yeah.
This is not going to happen again. And working through that over and over and over, and not assuming that because people have disabilities that they don't understand something like that. So Yvonne Musiani tells this wonderful story of Caswell, who had a massive neurodevelopmental disorder. So he didn't have language, he couldn't walk properly, and she used to say on a Saturday to all the boys, we're going to church tomorrow. He had brothers. And you must put all the vegetables out in the kitchen. And when we get back tomorrow, you cooking because I'm going to be tired. And she'd get up in the morning, and Caswell, who can't speak, communicates by grunting, has taken all the vegetables out and put them on the kitchen table, and he's pointing to the brothers to remind them they're going to be cooking. So we can't assume that because people are disabled, they can't register and that they don't get things. And so the patients who have survived need an enormous amount of help to say, this will not happen again, it should never have happened, and now it will be all right. Of course that might not be true, but that's the work.
And in the restorative justice inquiry, what should I be looking at in relation to survivors?
I think that ceremonies for survivors are as important as ceremonies for the people who've died. So in other words, it's one thing to have a one-on-one conversation and try and work through this. It always matters when that is stated publicly. So it's like someone saying they love you and then saying at a wedding they love you in front of everyone. And it's that somewhere there needs to be some public statement to the survivors. It can't just be private and hidden.
And let's talk about money again and survivors. Okay, let's talk about the apology first and other acts that would help stunt continuous stress or stressful trauma. What should we else be doing? And how do you plug in money in all that?
Well, I mean, in this
Because they are also entitled to compensation in financial language.
absolutely, and in this situation, it can really make a difference because the money can help the families to visit the people they love more, and basically just improve the standard of care. So money's essential here, because then at least what you gain from it, which also helps with having been let down, is look, I'm coming every week now. I'm not just coming at month end.
And would it be necessary to make specific orders of psychiatric and psychological intervention? Or is it adequate that there are at state institutions that will be able to provide it?
No, this needs to be specific.
You think there should be specific intervention
Yeah.
directed at the past trauma around the marathon?
Exactly.
project?
Because that also takes it seriously. It's also saying you're not just like one of the other patients, you have been through something very specific, and there is going to be a specific intervention to help you with that. Plus, you will still have access to everything that's available at the institutions. You're going to have more, not just what everyone has because of what's happened.
Yeah. I'm sure you're right. The fear to be thrown onto the back of a bakkie again should still be,
Yeah.
quite fresh and present. Very well. Counsel.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I've been hogging the space, but you can see I have issues in my head
No problem,
that I'll
Justice.
be left with when long after you guys are gone.
Indeed so, Justice. Ma'am, I just have a few questions for you. I've heard your evidence, and I'd just like to confirm, I understand you correctly that these families, of this, the bereaved families, they are not just simply in a process of grieving. They are in a totally different space, a worse space. And if I look at your report, in fact, you have diagnosed them with a disorder. Am I correct?
The families have not even started grieving. So grieving is not on the map yet. Continuous traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, it has the word disorder in it, but the irony psychologically is it's considered a normal response to an extraordinary event. So it's got the word disorder in it because it lands up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so people can use codes, that logistical stuff. But a traumatic response is considered an ordinary response, that almost anyone would respond in the same way.
Okay.
Because it's the event that is shocking, extraordinary, horrific, unexpected. And in fact, anyone who didn't respond in these ways, you would wonder what is going on inside this person. But certainly in terms of, if you asked it in another way, in terms of morbidity, there's a high level of morbidity, but it's not that the individual is pathological, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes
Yeah,
sense.
but the sharp end of the question was, do you consider yourself and your colleagues to have diagnosed the family to be suffering from that disorder?
Absolutely. In a way that I have never seen before.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Then just a second issue. To what extent would you say that accountability, holding those responsible, to what extent will this contribute to the families getting closure?
Enormously. We get very stuck in relation to each other when the other person doesn't hold themselves accountable or accept responsibility or apologize fully. You can't move. So you'll hear in ordinary relationships people saying that over and all I wanted was for you to acknowledge what you did. It's an ordinary, common thing. And in a situation like this, where there's been this dehumanization, it becomes absolutely essential.
See, I think that in respect of the accountability issue, I mean, the families have sit through these proceedings, and they've heard now that, you know, no disciplinary action has been concluded. Nobody has been charged criminally. None of those steps that will tell us that, listen here, do not worry, those that's responsible will be brought to book. We haven't seen that. Now, is there any other way that the families can get closure without receiving that confirmation or that evidence or that testimony that here are these individuals and they are now facing criminal charges, or they have now been found guilty in a disciplinary proceeding? What's your alternative to that?
Look, I think all the things we've been talking about will play their part. The thing that makes this different is mental health professionals are registered with legal bodies, and they have a legal and an ethical responsibility. This is not an ordinary infringement. This is an infringement on the part of people who had legal ethical responsibility. And so disciplinary action not being reported to the HPCSA, and I've heard what the advocates have said, that there's due process in terms of law, but at the end of the day, if that doesn't happen, it is completely unacceptable, and it puts our entire profession into disrepute.
And just the last issue, one of the witnesses testified, and she said, you know, she was feeling powerless when we asked, you know, how does it make you feel, you know? Machteloos was how do we give the people their power back, you know? How do we give them that back, that they feel the confidence to trust in the system again?
This process is part of that. You know, it's the families who pushed and pushed and pushed and asserted themselves, and then with the help of the advocates sitting here. So this in and of itself is something that the families have done, and they can feel very, very proud of that. And then all the other things like accountability, apology come into it. This is an empowering process. It might be frustrating, but it is empowering.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, Justice.
Well, I know you might think of going back the other side of the Yeske River, but it's late already. 4:30 is way too late to get back there on time. But thank you for those valuable questions. Counsel?
Thank you, Justice Msenek. Ms. Trotter, on page 13 of your, that is of the paginated documents, it's just for an inquiry. The last paragraph there, we have testified about this already, that it says the manner in which this radical displacement was carried out was such a sudden, vicious shock to the system, both individual and family, that it could not be absorbed and digested. And what I want to find out from you is that we have here families who did not know that their loved ones have been moved already to these NGOs. They only learned later when they were contacted that they had died. And this, I understand it to be making reference to the actual implementation of the, that is of the program, how it had an impact on them.
Yeah.
how would that is the impact on the families, those who had knowledge of the fact of the movement of or the relocation of their loved ones later or after the fact?
Sorry, you're going to have to repeat the question. I'm not sure what you're asking me.
How did the implementation of the project affect those who only learned of the move after the fact?
Those would be what? Family?
That is families, the survivors.
That's the whole idea of you've gone through an experience, but actually you've missed it.
Yes.
And so now the different parts of your mind are having to catch up with each other. And that's trauma. That's what's so devastating, is you can't undo the experience. You can't get rid of it because it goes in such a shocking way. So the sort of the physiological experience of it is intense. So you can't do what we all do and think, oh, I'm not going to think about that again. You can't do that. But you haven't actually absorbed the experience and made it part of who you are. So now you're torn between a part that's had the experience and a part that hasn't had it.
Had experience. Okay. Thank you.
Making it part of it would mean what? Learning to live with it.
Knowing that that's your dilemma, you're not going crazy, that this is what trauma does. And so if you start there with, okay, I'm having to catch up with myself. How am I going to catch up with myself? What do I need to catch up with myself? Then you begin that process. And different people will need different things.
And the second part to that, the fact that you learn that the move has already occurred, that is one. And then two, you learn that your loved one
Is dead.
not only is dead. What impact what's the level of impact this would have on the family?
Look, I think a lot of the family members here have spoken about it, that in a situation like that, actually the ordinary response is murderous rage. That you want to kill somebody. And you can't go and kill somebody. And so then you've got to push that murderous rage down, but then that doesn't help you deal with it. So it's a sort of a vicious cycle of a murderous rage and then a helplessness and a disempowerment. Very hard to be, I mean, that's how we torture people. That's what we do to them.
Yes. And you had been asked earlier about this continuous traumatic stress disorder. When does it end? So I want to know from your practice, you make reference on page 27 to, that is in paragraph 1 of the reparative and restorative justice, that it will not be possible for these families to do this psychological work without professional assistance. What professional assistance do you make reference to? And the level of intervention of that professional assistance, I want to know.
I don't think the families can deal with this without professional help. And so I think that every individual and every family has to be assessed. And then an intervention designed specifically for that family, so that you start to take into account at that level differences, variations, and then design an intervention for individuals and for the family as a whole. And that actually needs to go on until it's finished.
So the recommendations at the end of this process should be designed to such that it accommodates that intervention, and the frequency of the intervention will be determined by the professional intervention, I think, at the end of the process.
Exactly. So it's not something that should be, this should not be a default thing.
Yes.
This should be a very specific part of what happens at the end of the arbitration.
Yes. For example, you had been asked a question whether he had already diagnosed them. You are not able now to assist us with the frequency of the intervention in order to deal with the diagnosis. We can only do that after further interventions through professional help.
In terms of the families we consulted and in terms of all the oral testimony that I've heard and the fact that the story is the same in the affidavits,
Yes.
I'm pretty sure that all these families are going to need psychological assistance, that the level of morbidity is high enough that no one is going to be able to deal with this alone. And that it is always hard to say how many sessions specifically, but I would use the word, it certainly isn't short term, it certainly isn't 6 sessions. And the reason for that is it's going to be very hard for these families just to put their trust in a mental health professional to begin with. Just that is going to take time. And you can't instruct somebody to trust you. And especially in a situation like this. So establishing trust is going to take time, and then maybe the work can begin. Sometimes with work like this, it's helpful to take a break. So to have 15 or 20 sessions, have a break. See what the mind has done with it, how much has been metabolized, and start again. But it's hard to say because there are children involved, there are adolescents involved, there are families involved. So that's where the variation's going to come in terms of assessment.
Yes. And in relation to this professional assistance, we do know that we have your public health and your private health system and so on. What will be your view about what the recommendations should be?
I don't think it matters whether it's private or public. What matters is that the person doing the intervention is competent,
Yes.
and skilled in terms of trauma and in terms of working deeply. And what also matters is that if it is given over to public health,
Yes.
that it doesn't then disappear in ordinary, everyday public health life, that this has to be kept separate and be a very specific thing. So it's the competence of the person and their experience and skill that's the most important.
So there wouldn't be any difficulty if the recommendations were that, no, yes, this professional intervention must be provided by or under the auspices of the Department of Health, that is in your public sector.
In terms of the ability to do the work, no. In terms of the meaning of that for the families, it makes a difference. So in that situation, in the private sector, it's going to be hard to establish trust. If you put the families into the public sector, establishing trust, I mean, you're going to use so much time trying to establish trust just because of this experience. Everyone is too traumatized to just get past that, and that will contaminate the intervention.
Thank you, Justice. I don't have anything further.
Counsel for the state.
Thank you, Justice. Mr. Trotter, good afternoon.
Hi.
Let's go to your latest and updated report. And particularly, let's go to page 7, the paginated page 7.
Is paginated this number at the top?
The one written is with a marker. Through your testimony, you testified that the consultations with the family members was extensive, such that you had to, your team had to work in pairs. Is that correct?
Mm.
And on the second paragraph of the report, you recorded that the consultations took place over a 2-week period. Each interview lasted between 2 and 3 hours. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then you proceeded to state that each meeting was treated as a single therapeutic consultation. what did that entail in respect of an interview of each family?
The single therapeutic consultation.
Indeed.
Okay, the single therapeutic consultation is a form of intervening that arose during the states of emergency and during the 80s. The problem during that time is that when you were working with someone, you never knew whether they would be able to come back or not, either because they'd been detained or for a whole variety of reasons. And so an intervention was designed that could go on for as long as it needed to go on. So typically we will stop an intervention after a certain amount of time. The point with this intervention is if it takes 4 hours, it takes 4 hours. You try and arrive at a point of completion before you stop. And that's an unusual kind of intervention. And the reason we thought it would be appropriate here is because it was hard for these families to come logistically. So it was preempting that it might be difficult to come back again. People might not come back again. So to stay in the consultation for as long as what was needed and not allow time to be a boundary. That's really the aim of it. But you can then have a second consultation if you need. So it's the best of both worlds. It can be ongoing, but it is as complete as it can be. The other reason for that was because we anticipated the families would be in distress, and we didn't want to stop at a point and leave them in distress. So that the idea was to go on until the point where it felt okay to end. It just so happened that mostly the team reported that the interviews had taken between 2 and 3 hours.
And in that process of consultations, you indicated that the demeanor of the people interviewed was essential in your assessment of their circumstances. Is that how I understood your evidence?
When you say the demeanor of the people interviewed, you mean the families?
The families, yes.
And what is the question?
The question is, like, during the consultation with the family members, were you taking into account the demeanor of the responses which were given to you?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the great gain of the model that we used, is you're not standing aside and looking and measuring, you're in it. So you can be watching body language, you can be checking how much emotion there is, you're using that and working with that all the time, and that's invaluable.
So it was quite necessary that those who were conducting the interviews had to pay attention to all those factors.
Absolutely necessary. If I can take you to page 27, the paginated page 27. The first paragraph, it will be the third paragraph, but numbered number 1. Do you see that? Yes.
I'm going to read from the second sentence, which reads that the individuals in the families need to be assessed to determine the nature of the psychological intervention required. So that will go along with what you have just said, that like it is quite important and critical that each family had to be consulted.
Yes, so in other words, are there children in this family? Are there adolescents in this family? You would need to take all of that into account to determine what kind of, is it family therapy? Is it play therapy? Is it couple therapy?
Like if you look at the last sentence of that paragraph, it says that in addition, each family needs family therapy so that the family units can heal.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's then go back to page 6. it appears to be a very long paragraph, but I just want to refer you to a specific section. It will be about 5 lines from the bottom of that first paragraph. The sentence which starts with the level of rapport. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
It reads that the level of rapport, disclosure, and emotion was high in each consultation, and the families reported finding the process helpful and expressed their gratitude. So this was in relation to the interviews conducted in respect of each and every family in order to understand their circumstances of trauma if suffered.
Correct.
And would I be correct to say that in order to determine whether a person has suffered trauma, there is an absolute need that such a person should be consulted with?
You got to say it again. I missed it too.
I think what you're asking me is...
can I repeat the question? Will you agree with me that in order for one to be able to determine whether a person has suffered trauma, there is an absolute need that such a person should be consulted and be interviewed?
No, I don't agree with that.
How will you establish the experience without interaction with the victim?
So you cannot, obviously, without interaction with someone, you can't be 100% sure. But the whole trauma discourse, the whole theory of trauma, allows you to make predictions. So you could make a very, very reasonable clinical prediction that somebody having gone through that experience would be traumatized. Then there would be situations or factors in families or in an individual that would mitigate against that, but that would be exceptional.
Do you understand you to say that you can work on predictions rather than what the person actually expresses himself or herself?
They interact. So the trauma, an understanding of trauma clinically will allow you to make a whole lot of predictions about what might have happened to that person. Then you're going to find specific things when you interact with that person. Then you'll get an individual picture. But predicting and anticipating trauma does not depend on a personal interaction with someone.
Well, perhaps let's just start, let's just go back to the reasons why we are here. I just want to get an understanding from your earlier evidence of the objective why you had to come and give evidence before these proceedings. You had stated that your presence here was to come and make argument to the justice why certain findings should be found. Do you recall that?
Just say that in another way.
During the beginning of your testimony,
Yeah.
you testified that you were called upon to assist the arbitrator in your argument why certain findings should be made on behalf of the claimants. Do you recall
In
that?
terms of the outcome of the arbitration.
Indeed,
I think
yes.
in her expert opinion rather than argument.
Yes.
We agreed she's an expert. She's telling us about a field that that requires certain expertise that you acquire in a variety of ways. So hers are not arguments, they are expertise, they're opinions. That's why experts are allowed to express an opinion, because they're skilled, they're knowledgeable, they have expertise in the area. So I thought you would want to ask the witness, why is she here? And let her say it in her own words. And she might be able to tell you why she is here. I'm just changing the argument part. She's not entitled to argue either way. She's an expert who tells us what trauma is likely to ensue in these circumstances. That is in her opinion. In her expert opinion.
Ms. Trotter, on whose behalf are you giving your evidence?
Section 27.
Do you know who are the claimants in these proceedings?
The families who have lost people during the relocation.
Do you know what is the number of those families?
56.
56. And do you know that there is an aspect relating to redress and compensation in respect of each one of them?
Yes.
And do you accept that each one of them will have to make out their case for the relief that they seek in relation to such compensation?
No, I don't accept that, because my argument is that the experience of trauma is outside of context. It can be anywhere in the world, and you would be able to anticipate and predict that certain processes would have happened. There would be a certain impact. That's what trauma discourse is about. That's not to say there isn't variation, but the whole point is that based on the trauma and based on our knowledge of trauma, we can make certain predictions, which would then be refined in a one-on-one situation.
You have testified that 11 families of the 56 have been interviewed and consulted with.
Correct.
Are their personal circumstances the same?
No. The families and the constructions of the families were very diverse in terms of language, in terms of age, in terms of how they'd experienced the relocation. So it's a very diverse group of families.
Is it not the reason why you should went beyond 11 families?
Look, I can't say it in a different way to what I've already said it, that the thing about trauma is, of course, there's going to be individual variation, but the nature of trauma is you can make predictions across the families.
Let's go back to the question, and then like I'll pose another question. Was it not necessary, in light of your previous answer, that the circumstances of the 11 families varied? My question to you is, was it not necessary that in those circumstances you had to consult more than 11?
And my answer is no.
No. We are agreed there will be no heckling here, please. No. Shall we have silence, please? We have to go on. It's a legitimate question that counsel is asking, and it requires an answer. I don't think there should be any interruption in that process.
Still at page 6, the second paragraph, where you have recorded that the team has consulted with 11 families.
Yes.
Can you just indicate of the families referred to in this page, which of the families did you participate in the interviews?
I didn't participate in any of the interviews.
And then earlier on, you testified that the demeanor of the people interviewed, of the people who were interviewed, played a role.
Mm-hmm.
How would you have assessed their demeanor if you did not interview any of these families?
So then there are a number of ways of tackling that. So the clinicians, after they'd done the interviews, would use their notes and they would write up a report. And they would send that report to me, and then obviously I could ask further questions. That was the one thing. The second thing was that I then asked everyone to write a separate report talking about how the families had presented, the emotional tone for each individual member of the family, but also for the clinician, what was going on inside you. And then the third thing is that we held debriefing groups. And in those debriefing groups, the clinicians would talk about their experience. So I had a very intimate sense of what people were going through. Plus, after most of the interviews, I phoned the clinicians and I spoke to them. And then you write in the moment. How did it go? What happened? What was your experience of it? How are you doing?
You phoned the clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
Would it not have been necessary that someone with first-hand exposure to have been in these proceedings to express what they had observed? Would it not have been necessary for those people?
No, because I know each and every one of these 20 clinicians. I know them well and I trust them. I trust their skill and I trust their ability. And I was there all the time assessing where's everyone at, how they're thinking about this, and that's my skill, and that's why I led the team.
But you have never observed the demeanor?
No. But I have a report of that from all the clinicians.
Is that not hearsay from the other clinicians?
No, because part of our clinical skill is to be able to empathically get a sense of what's going on inside someone, even when they don't know themselves what's going on inside them. So that is part of our skill. That's what we're trained to do when you work psychoanalytically. That's our skill. It's one of our skills.
Are you in a position to assimilate the experience of trauma by one family to the other?
What do you mean assimilate?
Are you able to
Generalize.
Yes.
I'm able to make a prediction that out of these 56 families, this report will be absolutely accurate in terms of most of those families.
In the absence of an interview?
In the absence of an interview. Because we're not talking about individual pathology here, where what you're saying in terms of an interview becomes absolutely essential. We're talking about a trauma response, and there are specific guidelines for trauma responses which allow us to make predictions.
It's a little like asking an aerodynamic expert what would happen to an airplane of this size engine if it flew into the storm of this kind. They don't have to be there in person if they are experts in their field to tell you that this will be the likely consequences. If an airplane of this size engine, of this make, flew into a storm of this kind. Is that helpful at all in your cross-examination?
Justice, I beg to differ. We are not dealing with mechanics, we are dealing with feelings of individuals.
Yes.
So it becomes very critical that the individual circumstances of those who are affected need to be considered.
Sure.
It cannot just be done in general.
Now put it to the witness that her skill is not sufficient to predict responses to trauma by an individual. I mean, if you feel that it is different, then put it to the witness and debate it with it.
Yes.
You're entitled to do that.
Ms. Trotter, you have just said that you can use prediction to assess trauma of other family members.
Mm-hmm.
You have already testified that of the 11 families, their stories, circumstances, how they have experienced their trauma varied. And I therefore put it to you that in light of what you have said, it is not possible to generalize, or it is not possible to make a finding of trauma by prediction.
And I have evidence, concrete evidence, that it is. So in our very first meeting, as a group of professionals, we sat down and we thought, okay, that's without having met any family members. I only knew what I knew from the news. What are we looking at here? And I wrote up a protocol. And that protocol is what was used in the assessments. It's about a 10-page protocol. And in that protocol, I predicted what was going to be in this report. What I did not predict is that it would be much more catastrophic than I had imagined. So I was able to predict it because I wrote it up in the form of a protocol, and I have that protocol. And as I say, it was more catastrophic than I had anticipated.
So you were ill prepared.
No, we were absolutely prepared. Protocol was spot on. That's what I'm saying. When you say I can't say that, I can say I've got proof in the form of the protocol where our predictions were correct, but it was catastrophic. So what we had anticipated was absolutely there. But when you put it all together, it was hard. We were 100% prepared.
I think let's just make some progress. Still at page
Again, let me
6.
just repeat what we had said earlier. Everybody's allowed into any proceedings, provided they allow the proceedings to proceed normally. We cannot allow witnesses to be heckled or counsel to be heckled while having a cross-examination. You may or may not like the answers or the questions, but you must stay quiet, please, so that we can go through the work. Otherwise, those who don't like what your counsel say can heckle her in turn. We won't make progress. The advocate is entirely within his right to ask the questions, and the witness, having been sworn in, is obliged to provide answers. Proceed, counsel.
Thank you, Justice. Earlier on, you just confirmed that you never interviewed any of the family members.
Correct.
Do you understand what is hearsay?
Yes, it's when someone says that person said it, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is
And
that-
you don't have a recording.
Does the rule apply to an expert? Hearsay rule?
Well, Justice, it should be relevant in the sense that if an assessment of personal circumstances has to be made, then the person who is supposed to make that determination has to get first-hand information from the victim.
No, I'm talking about the hearsay rule as a matter of law. Could you ever say to an expert, you were not at the scene of the accident and you're trying to reconstruct it? I mean, or could you ever say to an expert, what you have been told are the parameters or facts are hearsay and therefore you can't express an opinion. Let's remember in our law, experts are not witnesses to give direct evidence, it's to give an opinion. As a matter of law, I want to hear your submission on that. Can you rely on hearsay rule in expert testimony?
My submission is that if the opinion is not based on fact, first-hand fact, then the expert will not be qualified to express such an opinion. That's what I'm putting to the witness.
And you say that's a matter of law? Is that what the law says about expert testimony? That witnesses must always be observers of the facts they're going to express an opinion on? Is that the submission?
It is an argument which I put to the witness in order to verify.
Well, for a moment, I wanted us to debate the law. We'll get
Yes.
back to the witness.
Yes.
Witness is here to take questions. I'm asking whether the question you are raising is a legitimate one as a matter of law. Could you say to an expert on Ebola, you must have been in Central Africa before you can tell us about Ebola and its evolution and its symptoms and its likely impact? If it's an expert witness, are
Well,
there different rules of evidence that we all well know?
Justice, what I want to submit is that it is well known that an expert should be able to be of assistance to the tribunal, as in this instance. And the assistance should only, the assistance from the expert witness should be based on facts. And facts which an opinion should be expressed. And what this witness has said, she did not have facts firsthand about what the families have experienced. So the opinion will be of no value and of no assistance to the tribunal if it's not based on fact. An opinion can't just be based on unfounded facts. That's what I'm submitting to the justice.
Let's see if further questions. We'll have to debate the
Can
law
I just
at
ask something?
some other time. But
Are the reports that the clinicians wrote, are those not the facts?
well, I'm not going to allow you to debate the law at this stage. This was an exchange between me and counsel, and the other advocates can, of course, chip in, particularly the one who called you, can express a view about the legitimacy of the question. Remember, it's about whether the question ought to be allowed or not.
Just I've been trying to intervene for some time, but you need to switch on one of your mics to allow.
Oh, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you. The question and this line of questioning can't be allowed because it's not permitted. If the line of questioning were allowed, it would mean that no expert who testifies, a medical expert, let's stick to medical experts and deal with humans, would be able to testify on the basis of pathology reports, on the basis of medical records, as to what happened in a particular scene, whether it's a scene of a crime, whether it's a botched operation, whatever the case might be. That is the reason why experts provide particular assistance to any tribunal. It's because they are experts and they are able to interpret what they see. Unless counsel is suggesting that the clinicians who were part of the team have manufactured their reports, this team worked together as a whole. Unless he's suggesting that, then I suggest he says so. But he can't continue a line of questioning on the basis of the hearsay rule when it's not applicable.
Do you have any response to that on the legal question before you proceed? In essence, it's an objection to the line of questioning. whether it ought to be permitted, whether you are allowed to tell an expert that an expert should be a direct eyewitness.
Justice, I persist with my submissions, and if it's a matter that has to be argued, we'll present an argument in relation to that. And then if I can
Yes, let's
proceed.
hear the further questions that you're going to put.
Thank you. Ms. Totta, please turn to page 27 of your revised report. The third paragraph, which is numbered number 1, you recorded that the second sentence, the individuals in the families need to be assessed to determine the nature of the psychological intervention required. And I've read this to you before, and the last sentence also records that each family needs family therapy so that the family units can heal. How will you make that determination when you have no knowledge of the individual circumstances of each and every family which affected by the tragedy?
Because these families have all been through the same trauma, and it's a human-induced trauma, and that allows me to predict that there will be similar responses across all these families, regardless of variations and context. And I say in the second sentence, the indication is that these individuals affected by the trauma need long-term psychotherapy. That is the indication from the consultations. You can't separate trauma out of this picture. You are not asking me to look at a group of patients and make a recommendation, and someone's got a borderline personality disorder and someone else is schizophrenic, where your questioning would apply. You're asking me about a group of people that has been traumatized. It is absolutely specific. You're not asking me about individual pathology.
No, but more directly, the psychological intervention required would require one-to-one consultations with clinicians, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the reason I say an assessment is because you're going to need to decide, are there children? What do the children need? Are they ready now? Do we need to wait?
Yeah, but in every family situation or every traumatized person, ultimately, as a restorative matter, you're going to have to talk to them personally.
Exactly.
And tend to their clinical needs personally.
Exactly.
You may proceed, Councillor.
Well, like, I just don't want to repeat this again, but like, from the exchange that you had with the justice, you concede that in order to make that determination, there is a need to consult with each family, not so?
No, I don't concede in terms of the trauma picture. So I concede in terms of the specifics of should it be play therapy or family therapy, but I don't make that concession in terms of the fact that these families are traumatized and need help.
So you concede that each and every family will have to be consulted in order to determine what type of therapy they require.
Yes.
And you can only do so when you know their circumstances, not so?
But I can project...
Like, let's just make it simple. Is it a yes or no?
I'm really getting tired, and I'm not sure exactly what your question is. I'm not conceding in terms of the trauma picture. And I don't know how to
the
say that.
client, witness rather, has answered the question. The question that was put to the witness was, can she come to the conclusion, based on this exercise and the project and the analysis and the teamwork, that the families who were subjected to this project suffered trauma? The witness answered the question.
Yeah, but you see, counsel, let's not be at cross purposes. Understand two separate sets of situations. May a witness predict certain pathologies and the remedy that might be required? That's one set. That's what experts are there for. The other one is, if the remedy she's prescribing in 27, will that remedy require personal intervention of clinicians? And that will require yet another answer. And I thought that's what counsel was pursuing. So we don't have to collapse, Ms. Trotter, we don't have to collapse the point you've already made. The current point is about reparation, is about the curative steps we need going forward. And that's how I understand the question to be. Yeah. And it does not diminish the point that you made earlier. So let's not fall back to that. You've been referred to page 27, and page 27 is about the curative measures you suggest.
And for that, you absolutely need
Yes.
an individual assessment.
Yes, that
because
is-
some
that is where
families
we
might
are.
not want help.
So take questions on that particular point. And I don't understand it to be, and counsel, you get my point, we should not conflate two things. The one issue is, may this witness predict what is the likely trauma that family members are to experience? That's the one thing. The other is, what treatment are they likely to need going forward? And yet another. And page 27 is about treatment into the future. But continue with the questions.
Ms. Trotter, like, just help us to overcome this lack of understanding. I take that we rely on you as an expert. What we need to establish is, how do you make a determination of the type of therapy without knowing the individual circumstances of each family?
You would need to have that assessment, as I state. But it would be helpful if the person has some understanding of trauma, but you would need to make that assessment, and that's a one-on-one thing.
So like, there's a need to have one-on-one consultation.
Yes, in order to determine the intervention.
In order to, okay, thank
Yes.
you. I think like that's quite helpful. And then like you have just confirmed that like you only interviewed 11 families whose circumstances vary. So I'm putting it to you that in light of what you have said, you cannot predict what therapy is required in respect of those families that you have not interviewed.
Correct. I can't predict what therapy is required. What I can predict is therapy is required.
Justice, I'm just being alerted to time. I'm not sure if like we should continue or...
As always, I'm in your hands. Let the respective counsel tell me what it is. It's 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
I would prefer to continue so that I can help the witness away. That is my, you know my inclination by now.
Yes.
I wouldn't want this witness to come back on Monday for a few minutes. If you're going to be long and you give us that indication, the witness comes back.
Okay.
If you're going to be winding up, then we wait.
Well, like
But there should be no
well,
impediment to
yes.
your cross-examination. You shouldn't limit it if you think you want to be longer with the witness. You're entitled to that.
Well, Justice, I really don't intend to take too long. I was just asking that in relation to
Or allegation to the
any need for re-examination which might prolong.
You, younger, you might have to go to a nightclub. But I'm quite happy to allow you to ask questions. Again, I repeat, the principle is quite clear. Nobody ought to be impeded in cross-examination only because of time. If you feel you can wrap it up soon, we're sitting. If you want more time, the witness has to come, it's under oath and will be obliged to come back on Monday.
Well, Justice, we really feel pressurized. Like there are some issues which we really need to debate with the witness, and we'll really like some more time. And on that basis, we request that we adjourn for now.
Absolutely. You're entitled to it. I will just make it over and over again. And we'll ask Ms. Trotter, your Monday has been pre-planned for you, which means we ask you that you, so shall we finish, please? We ask that you be here available
That's fine.
at 9:30 on Monday. Very well, thanks. You are excused from there. Counsel, is there any matter that we ought to canvass before we adjourn? We done. You're welcome to leave the seat if you feel like doing so now. We always have housekeeping matters that make sure the process goes forward. You are released from there.
Thank you.
Sorry, Justice. Could I get an indication from my colleague as to how much time he expects to be on Monday so that I can advise the witness that was due to arrive on Monday what time he should?
What time should you suggest, you excuse me, what time we expect you back here at 9:30 on Monday morning? Thank you, Ms. Trotter. What time we should tee up the next witness? What time should you think we do it? 10, 11,
I should
12?
be able to have wrapped up by tea time.
By tea time?
Yes.
Very well. So we ask the next witness to come here just after tea time.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But like all will depend on the answers. If the answers are short, like we might finish earlier. But if they are longer, like it might take a bit of time.
Okay, that is fair. That is the answer.
Thank you, Justice.
Any other matter which any counsel would like to raise before we adjourn? Very well, we are adjourned till Monday at 9:30.